Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this Clover series set, 13 unique designs in all. Let's go. Now this video is 1 hour and 20 minutes. We'll see if I have an hour and 20 minutes worth of things to say. Although, I do always surprise myself. The way that I talk to you in these voiceovers is as if I was teaching a class. And I always have a lot to say, so I'm really talking you through what I'm doing. If I repeat a lot of things, that's when I feel like I have less to say. But let's go. So I want to pause for a hot second and just talk about this outline that I'm doing here, because this is actually the only time that you're going to see me do the outline of the cookie in this loop fashion. I know other cookiers do this, so I wanted to try it out. I think one reason is that it's just easier on the hands because it's consistent pressure. You're not tapping down. But the other reason, I just assumed maybe it was because you get a cleaner corner, which sometimes can actually be challenging. If you, with your outline when doing those corners, because you can easily get too much icing if you're starting and stopping in that one tiny little corner. Now, this was the first one that I did, and to be honest, I didn't love the loop. I don't like having to flood over the loop, and yeah, it just wasn't as crisp of a corner as I feel like I can get without it. So just wanted to talk about that for a hot second. This Clover series here, so I have this thing, I don't know how many I've done so far, where I pick one shape and maybe another variation of the same shape, maybe a different size or a slightly different take on the shape. So like in this case, I did a 3-leaf clover and a 4-leaf clover. I've also done this with trees and hearts and circles. And I want to say there's something else, but maybe that's it. Okay. Yeah, so I do a limited number of shapes, a limited color palette as well. And I just let my imagination fly. And I'll talk a little bit later when I have some dead time about where I get my inspiration from, because I want to make sure I talk about this here. This is probably the most talked about cookie of the whole set, and I'm so proud to say that it was a total accident. Now, this continuous outline that I'm doing here was not something that I came up with. It was, as I was scrolling through Clover cookies on Instagram, this was something that I saw someone else do, and I'll tag them in the description of the video. But what's different about my execution here is I decided to push the boundaries here. And I'd actually already done this with 2 lines. And then as I was staring at this green cookie, trying to figure out how to finish it, I was originally going to give it a gold brush stroke to it, but I was just like, it needs more. And I thought, why don't I try doing 3 overlapped lines? Very stressful because in this set, almost all of the cookies, I only made 1 of each. So what I did first was I tested this out on some old cellophane bags that I don't use on top of the dried flooded green, just to make sure I was getting the right shape. I tried it out once, maybe twice. I think maybe it was just once. And then I was like, it's go time. Let's do it. So yeah, stressful. So then some things to talk about in terms of line work like this. Number 1, if you've ever taken a class from me, you know that I'm constantly, with love, yelling, lift your bag higher. You see how high I'm lifting my bag here? It's like upwards of an inch off the surface. And I can't explain it exactly, but just believe me, that's how you're going to get the most control over your icing and the cleanest lines, whether they be straight or curved. Now, it does also depend on how much pressure you're applying on your bag. See, it's like matching the distance with the amount of pressure, with the consistency of your icing and the size of the tip. Because if you are applying too much pressure for the consistency of your icing and the size of your tip, that icing is going to be coming out way too fast, and it's just going to feel like a stressful nightmare. But this is the best way to do it. You're guiding your icing, always keeping your eyes ahead of the icing. So for me, I'm a musician too, so it's kind of like reading music. You're always looking ahead. Some other things. So for line work like this, I use soft peak piping consistency. It's the easiest to work with. It's the easiest to come out of the bag. Also, I wanted the icing to kind of lay on top of each other as best it can, kind of sink into each other a little bit instead of just like staying too far apart, if that makes sense. Something else to keep in mind is you do need to be bracing your arm on the table, your decorating arm. So depending on, where your cookie is on the table, it's either going to be your elbow on the table, or for me, if I can put my cookie close enough to the edge of the table, I'll put my arm just above my elbow on the table. You want to make sure you have a full 180-degree radius on your decorating once your arm is in position. And because you don't want to have to move your arm as you're doing this. I think there was one point where I had to move my arm a little bit, and that's where you saw like a little jut. That's what that's from. And another thing that you can do if you have kind of a jittery hand is to brace your decorating hand with your non-decorating hand. I personally don't do this, but I know other people that do. Take your pointer finger and or your middle finger, and you can either place that lightly on the palm of your decorating hand or the bag itself. And this is not an indicator of how skilled you are. I know experienced advanced cookiers who brace their decorating hand, and there's no shame. I just personally don't do it. It's not how I learned. It's not how I decorate. So that was the 3-line, just calling it the 3-line Clover. Nothing special about it. If you have followed me for a long time, first of all, kudos to you, props to you. Thank you for being here. You will notice that I'm doing a 2 consistency outline and flood for this set. Number 1 is because, well, I was going to say it's because I did a lot of wet on wet in this set, but when I look at it, I didn't do that much wet on wet, but I was doing wet on wet on pretty large cookies. And the thinner your flood icing, the more time you have to work with it before it crusts. And if you're working on a big surface and you're doing wet on wet, you want as much time as possible to work with that icing. The other thing is just the fact that it's a large cookie. I will admit that so back to the large cookie, sorry, I only half put that thought out there. The larger the cookie surface, obviously, the longer it takes to flood it. And if you're working with a really thick flood, then it could potentially crust as you're starting to flood it, which is such a bummer. On to the 2 consistency. So, it is nice to have that crisp outline and then flood it. It does make the flooding a lot faster and less stressful. I do think that when you do a 1 consistency outline and flood, you may not get the crispest lines and outline on your shape. Not the end of the world, but just something to keep in mind that I have found. Here I am doing my wet on wet leopard print. I really like this. I love wet on wet, and I really love leopard because it has a lot of give to it. Like, it's supposed to look kind of messy, so it doesn't matter if your blobs are uniform. In fact, they're not supposed to be uniform. And yeah, so it's a lot more forgiving, I think. I honestly actually really struggle with doing wet on wet polka dots. I don't know. I can't seem to get perfectly circular polka dots. I don't know if it's my technique or whatever. They stress me out always. But yeah, so highly recommend this wet on wet leopard. You can do any color combo. My general rule of thumb is to do something lighter for the base flood. And then you want something really dark for this top detail I'm doing here. And then the other color is whatever. It can match or be in the same color family as the dark detail. I like maximum contrast like this. So you may not be able to tell here. I'm using the lighter yellow for this outline on top. And again, I only did one of these cookies, so the way that I tested out what color outline I wanted to do was, again, I took out my old cellophane bags. I tested out a few different color outlines on those bags, placed them on top of the cookie while it was dry, swapped them out, asked my roommate for her opinion, because at this point I'm always very indecisive because I'm tired. And I'm doing this one continuous line outline, which I am completely obsessed with. You'll see later that I do one other kind of outline if doing this continuous line is a little too intimidating for you. No problem. And there we go with the leopard print. Gotta love leopard. So what do we have next? I am poking the center as opposed to, I mean, you could use an edible marker, but you have to make sure you cover up the edible marker. And I don't know. Sometimes if I can, I just prefer to poke the cookie or the surface of the icing with a scribe instead. And I'm doing my outlines here first. All of this is a soft peak piping. You can use medium peak. If, I would only do that if your set that you're doing does not call for a soft peak. Just because, why would I not? The medium peak, the thicker it is, the faster it dries, and I feel like the less it really adheres to the cookie as it dries, if that makes sense. I don't know. I just feel like when I use a thicker consistency, I tend to knock off the outline more easily after it has dried. So just food for thought there. This was a happy accident, I guess. So those hearts don't touch, and that's kind of important for this next step, to make sure you have a little bit of space in between all of the outlines. So I'm flooding my base here. You're gonna see that sometimes I do a squiggle on the stem and sometimes I don't. I'll talk about the squiggle later, and the reason why I'm inconsistent is because honestly I just forgot. No other grand reason than that. So this technique here that I'm going to be doing is what I call the crackle. I don't know if there's a better name. I think I always say I don't know if there's a better name, but anyway. The crackle technique. So I love this technique for a variety of reasons. The reason that I chose to do it in this configuration is because, so these hearts are small enough, and the stem, that the chance of this, of these shapes cratering is pretty high. Unless I add that squiggle underneath, which again, at some point I'll talk more about. The squiggle is to help prevent cratering. So the beauty of the crackle, my friends, is that no one cares if it craters. No one's going to notice it is cratering. Side note here, you see that sprinkle, sprinkle, sparkle, sparkle. That is edible glitter, the Sugar Art Diamond Dust in white. No, not in white diamond. In 10K gold. I'm sorry, I forgot. 99% of the time I use white diamond, but I do have a couple of the gold ones. This is the 10K gold. Love it. Because I was going for gold with this set, obviously. So, the crackle here. I let this sit in my dehydrator for 10 minutes. If you're using a dehydrator, make sure you let the icing and the cookie come to room temperature back from being warm before you do this, because you don't want the icing to be warm. People ask me all the time, how long do you wait to do this? It's going to depend on how thick your flood icing is and the environment that you're working in. I just have a rule of thumb that I start my timer at 10 minutes. and I check it after that. If you're really nervous about this, maybe make an extra cookie that is kind of your ringer, and you can test it. You can test it out after 10 minutes to test a little bit, and then you don't have to ruin another cookie. Sometimes if it doesn't work after 10, I'll add another 5 minutes. But if you're working in a pretty dry environment and like pretty standard icing, then it should take about 10 minutes. Now I'm using a fancy fondant tool here, funny is I don't actually work with fondant. I just have this tool because it's going to get me the nicest crack or like shape of the crack. It does have a bigger end to it, which I use in different circumstances, but you can just use the end of a paintbrush. Just make sure it's a rounded end and not like a flat end. And what I'm doing here is I'm literally cracking the surface of that icing because it has crusted over. You don't want to puncture the icing. You know that you're puncturing the icing when you lift your tool up and you've got icing on the end of it. So just something to keep in mind. This is a little challenging in this space because you're working with a lot of outlines and you want to make sure I got a little too close to that outline there, or the edge of the shape. As you can see, I kind of punctured it too much. But you want to be cracking just like a couple millimeters into the edge so that you're not ruining the shape of the flood. So just something to keep in mind. Trying to remember before, as I'm just barely. Okay, I believe today, this next cookie is the wet on wet clovers. Again, this is something that I did not come up with myself. Many people have done it before. I was scrolling through the Clover options on Instagram and a lot of people have done this, and I was like, I want to do my own take on the little wet on wet clovers. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm doing a different color thick outline that is actually going to show up after I flood. My trick for this technique is to actually use flood consistency to do this outline. And I'm going to let this dry, and you'll notice that it's dried because it is the outline has become more matte. It's funny, I'm pointing at my laptop as if you can see me, but you cannot. So I like to use a flood because it flattens out more, and it just takes up more surface area than a piping consistency. You could use a piping consistency, but the tip of your bag would have to be pretty big to get as much surface area as I'm getting here. And because the wider that outline, the more you're going to see it poking through. Now, you can see that I was kind of a little nervous getting too close to that outline because you've got one try here. If you get too close to that outline as you're flooding, you're going to cover up too much of it, and then you're losing that effect. So I went on the safe side and made sure to flood kind of as close as far as I could, if that makes any sense. I got a little too close there, so I realized I need to like take out some of my icing. That's my Cookie Countess Thingamajiggy. Big fan of that tool for doing things like that because it's a lot thicker. It can just pick up more icing. So this cookie, I was very glad I used a thinner flood, and I was actually wishing, and you'll see once I get to the scribe part, that I'd used an even thinner flood because it had already started to crust, honestly, when I got to the scribe. But here we are. So starting off with 4 dots, kind of close to each other. You could just do 3 dots instead of 4 for a 3-leaf clover. Excuse me as I yawn. I'm doing this after yet another long day. It's Sunday. As of right now, I'm working 7 days a week, which, my friends, is too much. But I'm just embarking on week 7 of being a full-time content creator. And boy, is the to-do list never ending. And it's scary. It's scary, but I can talk about that maybe later. So just filling in the surface, not really a real rhyme or reason to where I placed all of the dots. Now, I'm using yet another scribe here. I have 3 scribes that I always work with. That pink one that you saw first, this one here, which is my smallest needle scribe, and then I have another one that's in the middle. That's a metal one. Now, I'm using, so obviously the smaller the needle, the less it's going to manipulate the icing. The bigger the needle, the more it's going to manipulate the icing. And I was working with a really small area here, so I wanted to make sure that I was manipulating as little as possible. Now you can see I instantly pivoted and made sure to scribe all of the clovers at the edge of the icing, and that's because I flood from the outside in, right? So the outside of the icing is going to crust before the inside of the flood. I should say the outside of the flood will crust before the inside of the flood. And I can tell, like, if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you can see kind of the 3D-ness of the white sticking up, and that is your visual sign that the icing has started to crust. Sad face. So if I was using an even thinner flood here, then it probably wouldn't have crusted. If you are doing the 4-leaf clover here, so I'm pulling the bottom 2 into the middle first, and then the top 2 for the most part. That was not not one of those. And there is a rhyme or reason to that, because you're ultimately pulling the icing, and I didn't want to have too much pull. So you can see that, like that one that I just said where I didn't do the bottom first, excuse me, you can see that it kind of pulled apart too much. You can tell that. No great shakes, it's fine. So using another scribe, or not another, the pink one again, and oh no, I'm back to this one. I guess I wanted a little more fine detail, and I'm just jiggling the surface of any of those last little bits that are kind of sticking up to help them settle into the flood icing. And then that's going to crust over, and I'm doing an outline here again. So this is the lighter green that's the same as the outline. I wanted to kind of tie that together. So I did 2 different greens, 2 different yellows, yellowy oranges, or orangey yellows, I should say. And obviously just thoroughly obsessed with this continuous line. Look how far I'm lifting my bag off the surface. I almost wish that I had this camera at like perpendicular so you could really see how high I'm lifting it, but for now it's a pretty good visual. And when I first started doing these cookies, I thought that it would be, I wasn't going to do this outline on top because I thought it was going to be too busy, but honestly I actually love the outline on top. And part of that is because I did it on so many cookies. So for a set like this, where I did 13 different designs, it helps to have a few different motifs that you carry through at least twice, if not more than that, on multiple cookies. So one of those motifs is the outlines, which I do in 2 different ways. Something else, which I guess is kind of a motif, is I leave an edge on the cookie so I don't flood all the way to the edge. And this is the first example of that, where I'm actually painting with the Sugar Art Sterling Pearl. I feel like this is super gold, but don't quote me on that. I definitely linked it in the description, so go check that out. And I'm using a new product by the Sugar Art, their color solution. I used to use Everclear, which is a really high alcohol proof clear alcohol. This here does have a tiny bit of alcohol in it, but it also has other things, which I think, I could be imagining it, but I think gives it more time before it dries, and this stuff can get real gnarly when it starts to dry. Like, it gets really lumpy on you. And you do need to have a little bit of alcohol in there because you need the liquid to evaporate, right, so that it can dry. So that's what I find that I lost my train of thought. So sorry. I was just staring at myself piping. Okay. So here we go. I'm doing this outline here, trying to keep a pretty consistent border of that gold. I don't know, maybe 1/4 of an inch. Make sure that you go far enough in the corners with that gold. I think I realized at some point, oh, maybe it was a different design that I was doing where I didn't go far enough into the corners. Whoops. I just love this effect. All right, so I have outlined this, and I don't think I wait for the outline to dry. No, I did not. Because I didn't feel like I needed to. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I need to let the outline dry. Sometimes I don't. So the question is, why do I not sometimes? Great question. Great question. If I'm flooding a challenging shape, then I will let the outline dry first, for sure. In this case, because I'm not flooding all the way to the edge, it's almost like the outline has an easier job in a way to hold the icing in. So, you know, if you let the outline dry, then you have just a sturdier outline, obviously, to hold that icing in. Now, I just want to talk about here. So you can kind of see the striations of my icing. That means that my icing started to separate. Normally I would freak out about that because it's going to dry like that. It's not going to dry all like smooth and even and pretty. But actually, I don't know. Maybe I cannot recall if this was part of the plan or not. But if I ever get something like that, where my icing has separated, I love doing a splatter because it covers that up and no one will know. No one will know. So this here is new to me. I'm actually doing a dry dust splatter on the wet icing, which I am obsessed with. If I can do this, I will do this instead of the wet splatter now because it just dries so well. It sinks into that icing and completely dries. You don't have to mix the powder with anything wet. You just take it straight out of the bottle. It's amazing. That's the same sterling pearl powder that I painted with, just dry instead of wet. So this is the other outline that I did. Again, not something that I personally came up with. A lot of people do this kind of outline on Clovers. This is just another option. And I'm touching down in the center each time, which can be a little less stressful, you know, if you're not flooding or piping quite as much. I just love how classy this cookie is. It's simple in a way, but it's very refined. And I think what adds to the refined element, honestly, is that the outline is the same color as the flood. And it's actually only 2 colors in that whole thing. Okay, up next, we have the beer. This one I'm real proud of. I mean, so this set is a nod to St. Patrick's Day. It's not like super St. Patrick's Day, but obviously the colors are St. Patrick's Day-esque, and I'm doing clovers. And beer. Beer, my friends. Beer is a part of the celebration. So I wanted to make a Clover beer. And I chose the 4-leaf instead of the 3-leaf because I wanted there to be kind of as even of a, top portion to kind of have the bubbles come down from. And I also just wanted more surface area for the bubbles. So let's talk about the yellows that I did in this set. The greens have like the tiniest, favor blue just the tiniest bit, like are a little more blue than yellow. The yellows, I wanted to make them kind of an orangish yellow, not like a pure yellow. So I did actually color it yellow, and then I added some old orange icing. This one looks more yellow, but I would say the darker yellow is like really more on the verge of orange. And the reason for that was I wanted to kind of straddle doing a nod to St. Patrick's Day and the Irish flag, which is of course green, white, and orange. But then also wanting to do more yellow than orange to pair with the green and the gold. So that's where I came up with the kind of yellowish, or excuse me, orangish yellow. Now I did this floody do, and okay, so again, this is not something I came up with. People have been doing this technique for ages for anything beer or golf balls. Same technique. So in a darker color, or could be lighter color, you flood these circles. You don't have to get too crazy about the top of them because you're only going to end up seeing the bottom of the circles. Again, this is where a thinner icing is going to help you out because you're doing a good amount of wet on wet. And then take the same color as the flood. And if you were doing smaller dots here, I would encourage you to just like actually pipe a dot. But because these were pretty big, I just ended up kind of doing my own little half moon shape. And there are two ways to do wet on wet, or no, there are a variety of ways to do wet on wet. But you can actually kind of stick the tip of the bag into the icing and actually flood into the icing. Or you can do what I'm doing here, which is I'm actually just adding icing on top of the flood. If you do it the other way, you're adding a lot more icing to the flood and you have more of a chance of over flooding, which is not good. Not good. So I'm going to let that... Oh, okay. That one didn't quite settle. Needed a little bit of help. That's where I do the little jiggle with the scribe there. And I'm going to let that crust. And I'm going in. So this, in my opinion, these bubbles need to be a medium peak, which is kind of annoying because I don't make medium peaks that often for a set, but it really needs it to hold its shape. Even though it's annoying to make the medium peak, it is one of those details that is so fast to do and has such an impact. It looks so good. I was very stressed about this. This is the first one that I did. I ended up doing 2 beers because I had an extra cookie. But I only thought I was going to be doing one of these, and I was like very stressed because I hadn't exactly plotted where I was going to put the bubbles, which you can kind of see as I'm trying to figure out where I want to do the next bubble. And then I decide after I do this that just needs like a little more dimension, so I add a second layer in a couple of spots just to build it up more. And that is a pretty big tip on that bag, side note. Or decently sized tip. So I just keep refining this by adding a few more bubbles, and then I'm happy with it, I think. Yep, I'm happy with it. Okay. Isn't that cute? Ugh. Love the beer. All right. Up next, we have... So this is, again, is this a motif? I don't know. But not leaving like an edge on the cookie. So with that gold one, you saw me painting the edge. In this case, I'm going to be adding a beaded border once the rest of the cookie is done. So first, I'm just giving this an outline. Whenever I do shape series sets, I always try to make sure that I have kind of a good balance of... I guess with any set, that I have a good balance of each color represented as a main flood so that there's good color variation, not too much of any one color. Sometimes that backfires with Shape Series sets because I always do more designs than I need, or that I ultimately need in the end, because I want to give myself the permission to fail, right? I personally love creating these sets because I give myself space to fail. Okay, come back to that in a second. That squiggle there is what I was talking about to prevent craters. Craters happen when icing dries. It kind of sinks in the middle. It can be anything from just like a dip to an actual hole in the icing. The smaller the area, the more pronounced it is. No matter how big your cookie is, it's always going to crater. It's just way more pronounced in a smaller area. So that stem, I just did that there because I remembered I'm not used to doing that technique. I'm really not used to using a thinner flood. I think that's the bigger thing. So the thicker your flood, the less likely it is to crater. This is obviously a thinner flood that I'm used to. But anyway, so back to the permission to fail. That's why I love this set. I come up with more designs than I need. And it's because that means that it's okay if they don't all work out. I think I started with 18 designs, and of the ones I actually ended up executing, only 2 were complete failures. Now, I know you're going to ask, can we see the complete failures? I'm the worst at making sure I film them, and actually one of them, I forgot to film the second stage. Not because I knew it was going to be a fail, but then it just kind of ended up being fine because it was a dud. Here I am doing that dry powdered effect again. Obsessed. And it's okay that I'm getting it on the edge of the cookie because I'm going to be covering that border with icing. So not a problem. Not a problem at all. I also personally, when I come up with a color palette, 99% of my color palettes, no matter what the set is going to have white in it. I don't know why. I guess, I don't know. I just feel like every set needs to have white. Sometimes it's like an off-white, very rarely, but usually it's like a bright white. It's just easy to make. It gives nice contrast. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, let's talk about this beaded border. So this is beaded border a la Sweet Am's. I'm pretty sure I don't know if she came up with it, but she certainly made it famous. This is actually one of the first things that I learned 10 plus years ago when I was teaching myself how to decorate with royal icing with blogs and YouTube. Sweet Am's is one of the blogs that I used. So this is another technique that really needs a medium peak. If you use a soft peak, it might look okay when you first start piping it, but then as it starts to dry, the beads are going to kind of melt into each other, and then you're going to cry because it's like, why did I spend all that time doing that border? And now it doesn't look like anything. So how do you do this? This is that pressure piping technique that I do a lot. I do little tiny hearts. I do this with scales on like a fish or a mermaid, or that sweater technique that you've seen me do. So what it is you're piping a bead and then you pull away from the bead. And as you pull away from the bead towards the surface of the cookie, so pulling away and down, you are also releasing pressure on the bag. So it's a lot of things to do all at the same time. A lot of multitasking. It's definitely a hard concept to wrap your brain around, but it's so effective. I think for this border, this is one of the last things I did. I made the tip of my bag a little bit bigger because it was requiring too much pressure to create the size beads that I needed to make this border to kind of fill in all of that edge. So just keep that in mind. The size of the border that you leave of that naked cookie dictates how big you're going to have to make this beaded border. And just especially if you're using tipless bags, you're going to need to cut a bigger tip. And if you're doing this like in the middle of decorating a set, that might be kind of problematic. if you need a smaller tip for other things in the set. So just something to keep in mind. I'm going to take a water break for a moment, and I'll be back when the beaded border is done. All right, we are done with that border. We are 40 minutes into this video. That means that we have, can I do math? Does that mean we have another 40? Yeah, we have another 40 minutes left. Oh my God. All right, I can do this. So this is the same kind of border that we did on the green cookie. And I decided to go all white with this cookie, mainly because I didn't have enough white represented, in my opinion, in the set. And you know what I said earlier, I like to have an even representation. And there we go. But I love how angelic this one looks with all the white and the bit of gold. So next up, we have this wet on wet. Trying to think if there's anything specifically that I want to talk about. I don't think there is, so I'm going to come back when we are at the wet on wet stage. All right, we have flooded the cookie and now we're doing our wet on wet. I'm just gonna say, so I only made one of these and I really wish that I had, after I made this, I realized that I wish that I had pulled this kind of rainbow arch down to the lower portion of that clover leaf to mimic the where it started, if that makes sense. But you live, you learn. This is one of the most stressful things about doing one of each cookie, because sometimes I put a lot of time into planning and sometimes I don't, but either way, sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And this is one of those moments where I was like, I just gotta let my perfectionism go. It is, I actually had to show this to a friend once it was done and she was like, it's pretty. Like, you're too hard on yourself. So here we are using that small scribe again because I want minimal disturbance of my icing. And I eyeball most things, and the way that I do that with spacing like this is I just divide sections in half. So I started on the ends, went to the middle, then I divided each of those 2 sections in half, and now I'm dividing these 4 sections in half. And that's how I get relatively even spacing for something like this. I also had inspiration for this from another set from someone else, and I will link that in the description. Just using my scribe to kind of settle out any little bits that were sticking up. And then I let that dry. This is where I really went out on a limb. So I wasn't originally going to do an outline on this design. But as it was just sitting there with just that wet on wet, I was like, this isn't enough. There isn't enough detail on this cookie. So I decided to add the outline. I thought this was going to end up being a total complete dud, honestly. And again, I played with what color outline I wanted. I had those samples already done on a cellophane bag and they were dried. So just kind of play with putting each one on top of the cookie to see which color I like the best. And I ended with the lighter yellow, which is what this is. And I actually ended up really liking this cookie with the outline. I know it's a lot going on, but it's got this like 70s vibe to it, and I'm super here for it. I'm super here for it. So here's another one, which is that kind of border technique in a very different way. So the first thing I'm doing is painting the surface with medium peak, or maybe it's soft peak. I just wouldn't use flood in this case, especially using white, because I wanted the most coverage and I wanted some texture. If you're going to use a flood consistency for this kind of technique, it's a lot easier. What am I trying to say? It's not going to leave as much texture, right? Because it's a thinner icing. And you can see here that the surface of my cookie is not perfect. It's a little lumpy, which probably means it was towards the end of my dough. And the beauty of this design is that even though I'm not flooding the whole surface, it's still covering the surface, which is awesome. And although I'm going to flood, I'm going to flood part of this cookie. This was my second try actually on this design. And the first try, I tried to just paint the edges, like I did with the gold. And then when I went to flood, I realized that I didn't paint enough of the cookie to cover it with the white, which was a bummer for sure. So just to prevent any heartache once I get to the next stage, I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to paint the whole thing. No harm, no foul. We good. Could potentially have benefited from a larger brush. Larger brushes are obviously going to cover more surface area. And you do need to work kind of quickly with this technique because... why? Because your icing will start to crust, obviously. So do like one section at a time instead of trying to tackle the entire cookie in one go. That would be my piece of advice for that. Now, you can see that slightly shifted, that the shininess from the icing went away, and that means that the icing has crusted over. And And I did my little pokey poke thing in the center just to mark the center of the cookie. And I'm doing this a lot thinner than that green one because I'm going to be covering this in sprinkles, pretty big, coarse sanding sugar. And I wanted there to be as much border of white as I could get. And part of the reason that I did this for a second time as well is because I made the outline too big, like covered too much of the cookie. So by the time I put the sprinkles on, and the sprinkles are going to weigh down the icing from the weight of the sprinkles. So it's going to weigh it down and it's going to spread it out more. And I just wanted to prevent that. So if you make this a little smaller area, just like if you're going to put sanding sugar on the entire surface of a cookie, you always want to flood it not quite to the edge so that there's some room for the icing to kind of spread out a little bit. I did not let that border, the outline, dry because I wanted, if I could, I wanted to get the sprinkles to adhere to it. And if it's dry, it's obviously not going to have sprinkles adhere to it. So this is a coarser sanding sugar. I think this is Wilton. There are two main sizes of sanding sugar. There's this really coarse one here, and then there's the smaller, finer sanding sugar. And I chose this intentionally because the coarser sanding sugar is going to stand out more and just give you more texture, and that's really what I wanted. Now, the icing here is fresh. It's wet. And I'm using my scribe to just kind of help shape the edges of this heart. Now, what this does is I'm obviously like pressing the sprinkles into the icing, so you don't get quite as much like sprinkle sticking out, which is kind of a bummer, but just since I was going for like maximum texture. But that's okay, because that's in favor of kind of pressing the sprinkles in, which to make sure I'm getting a good shape. So it was worth it to me. All right, this next cookie I think took me the longest, somewhere around 11-ish minutes. So I'm definitely not going to be able to talk through this whole thing. But let's talk about this design. So this was another one where I kind of melded inspiration from other cookies into this one. So it was two pieces of inspiration. It was this two-toned leaf, and then the stitches you'll see me do at the end. So let's talk about where I get my inspiration. For the shape series, it depends on how much my juices are flowing. So my creative juices, to clarify. Sometimes I just sit down with my iPad and I just start writing out a list of ideas, and it just flows, and I come up with like 20 plus ideas just from my head. Other times I'm struggling with my inspiration for whatever reason, and when that happens, I turn to Instagram and I will search hashtag like Clover cookies, shamrock cookies, St. Patrick's Day cookies. I will search whatever topic I'm doing plus cookies in a hashtag, and I will find ideas. Now, these days, when I first started out, I would copy designs exactly. And I think that's what everyone, when they're first starting out, should do. Like, that's what any artist does when they first start learning how to be an artist, is to copy the greats, right? And then as you do it more and more, you get used to your own style and you start creating your own design. So pause on that thought. I just want to talk about what I'm doing here, which is I did do the outlines in the appropriate colors. I'm doing the little crater prevention in the same color, and then I'm going to flood on top. I do not let the squiggles dry. I leave them wet. Some people let it dry, but I think it's better if you don't let them dry. So just a side note there. So back to inspiration. So these days, I try to not copy anything exactly ever. I try to do more original designs. Like if I can do something completely new from my head, that's awesome. but sometimes I need a little help. You know, like anyone, I need inspiration from elsewhere because I'm just struggling to find it myself. So when I find inspiration from other designs, other cookiers, what I try to do is like take an element of that design and incorporate that into something that is my own. So in this case, this is probably a bit more of a literal inspiration, closer to what the original person did. I can't remember how she finished this. It wasn't with the stitching. But I combined different ideas from different cookies that I had seen. So this two-toned here, and then you'll see the stitching that I do at the end. What I'm doing here is I didn't quite get the separation right with the two sections, so that's super easy to fix with wet on wet if you work at it soon enough while the icing is still wet. So this here, I just didn't like the little tip, so I just tried to fix that a little bit. I'm going to end up covering that center line with stitching anyway, so excuse me. That's fine. So back to Inspiration Land. What can I say? So another example of like taking inspiration from elsewhere and making it my own, like the first cookie I showed you, that continuous line outline, I did not come up with that myself, but I stretched the limit on it and made it my own. So I did a double outline, which you haven't seen yet, but I did that in other cookies. And then I did that triple outline. I certainly have not seen that anywhere. Kind of took it to the next level, made it me, and it's something I ended up being really proud of. I always design my sets in Notability on my iPad. It's an app. I know a lot of people use Procreate. I still have not figured out how to use Procreate. Notability is more like a note-taking app, and like the drawing capabilities are pretty basic, but it's good enough for me because I'm not that great at drawing. So I don't do a super detailed sketch. I just do something that's good enough so that I know what I'm working with. Right, so I plan everything on my iPad. I write all my notes. I have a different note for each set. I write a lot of things down. I have my color palettes, my inspiration photos, pictures of the cookie cutters, if there are sketches that come with them, the list of all of the designs that I'm doing. I try to also write out timings for everything so that I can reference it later to know how long it actually takes me. And, oop, not quite done yet. So I'm going to let that crust over. And I'm doing this stitching outline. So using a soft peak on this one, I do wish that I had a slightly smaller tip on my bag. But, you know, rolling with the bunches here. That's what I had already cut. This was late in the game on the set, and there was no going back making this smaller, so here we are. I think I'm going to leave you here with this stitching, and I'll be back when I'm done. All right, there we go. There is the stitched duo color cookie. All right, so we are doing another white inspired design here. And again, this is because I wanted to make sure I had another white cookie. This was kind of the same family as that other 70s inspired green cookie. This is a slightly different take. So I'm going to leave you here with the outline and the flood, and I'll come back when we are on to the wet on wet. All right, let's talk about this wet on wet technique. So, piping these lines first, and I will have to say, if you've ever piped a flooded line, it is stressful. Stressful. The icing comes out of the bag so quickly, you have to move very quickly. You're more likely to get kind of the beads at the start of the line, which you can see especially on that second and third green line that I piped. Looking at this, I wish that I had made the third set of lines closer to perpendicular. They were a little too far right. Oh well. But, you know. And then once I pipe those, I'm using my small scribe again. Minimal manipulation of the icing. And what you don't see me doing off screen is I'm cleaning off my scribe after every pull. And that's how you get this clean effect. If you don't clean off your scribe, when you pull your scribe out of the icing, it always has icing on it. It has all the colors on it. So if I were to not clean off my scribe, the beginning of that pull would be really messy every time. So that's not good. We don't want that. Sometimes I pull both ways, but in this case, I just wanted this like pulling down motion. There are a lot of so much variety with wet on wet. Such a big fan. One of the first techniques I ever learned again. And I think it's such a great technique. Now, here I am. I'm doing my first double line that you've seen, and I just want to talk for a second. If you can see on the stem of that clover, there's kind of a crack 3/4 of the way up. That is because I was not handling my cookie all that well. So, in this particular shape, the stems were a bit more fragile than the rest of the cookie. And those cracks will happen when you are handling your cookie a bit too roughly before enough of the flood has dried. So I don't know what exactly the percentage is, but if you have enough wet icing underneath that crust on top, and you're moving your cookie around and you're like jostling it, and especially like moving it out of kind of parallel to the ground, if you're turning it at an angle, then that wet flood underneath is going to move, right? And if there's enough of it underneath the crust, then it's actually going to kind of like I was going to say like an earthquake. Is that a good metaphor? Someone has a better metaphor, drop it in the comments. Anyway, so it kind of, the wet inside jostles the semi-dry surface, and that's what gets those cracks. So it's a very common problem, especially for beginners. And there we go. This was another one that I thought was going to be a dud. But I pushed through. I finished it off with those lines in the white, and I actually ended up really liking it. Someone called it like an Argyle sweater. I was like, yeah, it looks like a sweater. It looks like a ski lodge sweater, which I'm super down for. So this one is a cutout, and this is, again, super common in a lot of Clover designs, is doing this cutout. You can do a Clover cutout. I'm doing a heart. And what's important here with cutouts is I always do an outline. Always. I do not have the what's the word? The drive, the inspiration. I don't know what I'm trying to say. No. I was going to say the balls, but better way to say it. I don't have the nerve to not use an outline, because if you're not going to use an outline and let that dry first, then, or at least just use a piped outline, like a piping consistency, and then flood it, the flood is going to weigh into itself, and it's going to end up covering more of that cutout than you intended. And depending on how big the cutout is, it might even completely cover the cutout. And then it was like, what was the point of doing this? In this case, I'm going to be honest here. I did not let my my outline dry. And that was because I'm using a piping consistency outline, which I know is going to hold in my flood. And if I can, I actually like to flood right away, because then the flood can kind of melt into the outline more, especially at that cutout, and you get a bit more of a seamless look. Now, this is where I wish that I had put my heart a little farther to the left so that I had more area on the right side of the heart. And you'll see that at the end when I try to figure out how to finish this cookie. Just adding a bit more flood to some areas that I think are likely to crater. That's best done at the end once you've flooded the whole cookie, and then you kind of stick your bag just into the surface of the icing and kind of inject it with more icing. Like Botox. That's a good metaphor. You're injecting it with icing Botox. So I just want to take my scribe here and make sure that I am getting the flood into the nice little corners. I did kind of play with fire, though, with how much icing I added around that cutout. You can see, especially when it dries, how much it has poofed in. There we go. But because I had that outline, it was all good. I'm using the lighter yellow here to do this beaded border. One note, I'm using a cookie swivel here. I use the one from LC Sweets. Pretty sure it's linked in the description. You see me rarely use this, largely because, well, for two reasons. As a content creator and creating videos, I don't think it's very visually appealing to watch cookies done with the cookie swivel, because especially when it is sped up, because you kind of get dizzy watching the swivel constantly move. And then the other thing is, I just think that if you use a cookie swivel too much, it creates kind of a handicap in your decorating skills, because when you use a swivel, it makes it very easy to constantly have your cookie at the perfect angle. And I see people who clearly only decorate with a swivel, and they're not able to pipe a continuous outline on their cookie without moving the swivel, which I think is a disservice to yourself as a cookier, just because I think it's important to be able to learn to maneuver your bag around the cookie. Now, that said, it is a great tool if you're a beginner and you're really struggling with that outline, because it's always easier to pipe one way and not all the way around. That's kind of why circles are the death to so many people, because you are forced to pipe a continuous circle. Now, as I was saying that though, I've definitely seen people outline a circle with a swivel and move the cookie in the middle of the outline, and it kills my soul just a little bit. Partly because I know they're like a more advanced cookier, so it's like, come on, you can do it. I know you can. All that said, if you are a beginner and you find great peace and comfort with your swivel, do not let me judge you out of using it. Again, I've just gotten used to using it, to not using it, because I film everything. But this kind of design technique, so if you ever see me use a swivel, that's because it is really necessary for that technique. This technique can only be done at one angle. At least I think it can. I don't think it can be done at multiple angles, because it's just a very challenging technique to do. Now, I tried to, this cookie did not look done to me where it was right there. And I wanted to do an outline like I've done on other cookies, but because my heart was so close to the edge, unfortunately, I couldn't fit an outline. So I decided to finish it with a wet splatter. The other splatters you see me do are dry splatters. This one here is a wet splatter. And for that, I use the same powder, but I mix it with the color solution. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And at some point I will be done with this splatter and then I'll be done with the cookie. Let's see if I get there in the next century. Come on, Grace. You can do it. You can do it. There we go. All right. We are on to the last cookie in the set. Whew, I don't know about y'all, but this has been a long video. I know many of you like the long videos though, so you are welcome. That's another thing whenever I do these shape series, I'm obviously doing a lot of designs, which inevitably creates longer videos because I just have more designs to cover. So we are starting off here with that thicker outline technique where I'm using a flood consistency to outline first. This does require a lot of control, as I mentioned. Outlining with a flood is a little scary because the icing comes out of that bag real easily. And this is the same size tip that I'm using to actually flood. So, and this is the same tip here, just a different color. And the difference here is just that is the pressure on the bag. This is what a lot of people don't understand, is that especially when doing a one consistency outline in flood, it's all about the pressure on the bag. So to do that outline, just barely any pressure, but to do this flood, I always compare it to like opening a pickle jar. Like that's how much tension you have in your hand. And depending on how thick your flood is and how big the tip is on your bag, it might be a really difficult pickle jar, in which case probably not good for your hand. And you should, if you can, open up the tip of your bag a little bit more. But there is such a thing as too big. I do find with a lot of beginners that they're afraid to apply too much pressure on the bag, fear of popping it. And I just want to make sure I say this, by the way, because I'm not sure if I said it on the first cookie. You have to let this outline dry. When you're doing this other color that peeks through, you have to let it dry. Anyway, back to popping the bag. So cheap bags you can actually pop. It's most common to pop them at the seams, but if you see any like stretch marks on your bag, that means that the plastic has been stretched and it will pop. Probably. The bags that I use are by Borderlands Bakery, and she has found like the thickest plastic that you can possibly use and have it still be a tipless bag. So with this one, I've used hundreds of her bags, maybe thousands, I don't know. And I've had like 2 pop maybe. But before I use this brand, I used other brands, and I had popping like maybe every set. It was bad. So that's one of the many reasons why I switched to these bags. So you can apply quite a lot of pressure. Here I am doing that 2 outline again. And this one is certainly easier to see than the white one, so I wanted to talk about it here. Now, it's important when you're doing more than 1 outline here is 2 things with this continuous outline. So you need to make those loops bigger so that you have room for the second outline in there. And then the second thing is that you need to bring your outlines closer together in the center. When you're only doing 1 outline, you have more freedom in how big the loops are and how close the icing is in the center. But you see here, I'm really struggling. Like, that first loop was definitely smaller than the rest of them. And I was very much regretting how big that first loop was. But again, I made one of these cookies, so I had 1 shot to get this right. And I really like, again, the simplicity of this. It's 2 colors. The first outline I did is the same color as the outline on the whole cookie that I flooded the outline. And then this inside one is the same color as the flood. And, 2 colors. And I think there's like huge bang for your buck here. There's a lot of technique, granted, in this outline situation, but it's just stunning. It's just stunning, if I do say so myself. So there we go. Wow. That is the last cookie in this set. That is the whole set. Yeah, you'll see that other dark green leopard. I didn't share that because I forgot to film the outline, but also it's exactly the same as the orangey yellow leopard. Different colors. So anyway, thank you so much for spending this almost hour and a half with me. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you try one of these, or maybe not, just enjoy this, and have a sweet one.